winning a UFC title, which I did in 98 till 2001, held the title for, it was actually about 3.5 years, and then coached 12 world champions and put 95 kids into televised careers.
Welcome to this episode of Chattin with Staxx. I'm your host, Bill Staxx, and today we got Pat Miletich. How you doing, Pat?
I'm doing good, Bill. Thanks for having me, buddy.
Definitely. Thank you for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, that's I'm always excited to talk.
Me too. This is what I get paid to do, the big bucks, you know?
There you go.
So, for the people that don't know who you are, you want to introduce yourself and tell them where you're from?
Sure. Born and raised Bettendorf, Iowa. Grew up wrestling, playing football there. It's kind of a hotbed for wrestling and football in certainly in Iowa and the Midwest. At one time, and still is, kind of a conveyor belt into Division I sports out of that community. And so a lot of thoroughbreds, so to speak, came out of there. It's a blue collar agriculture type setting with a lot of hardworking people, just with nose to the grindstone mentality. So went to school for a couple of years in college. Mother got sick with heart problems. Left to go back home and kind of help her out. Was working 3 jobs at one time, pouring concrete and then doing security at nightclubs and bartending. And mother needed bills paid, so it was kind of ironic how it all worked out. I had a foreman in my concrete job that was a black belt in karate and said that a karate man could beat up a wrestler anytime, and he was from Kentucky and didn't know any better, so I had to we went out in the field and I threw him around a little bit and woke him up. Then he gave me a free week pass to his karate kickboxing gym that he trained at. And that's kind of how my martial arts stuff started. I had boxed a little bit earlier in life, but got into the karate, got a black belt, 4th degree black belt in Shorei root karate, and started getting into judo and sambo and jujitsu and Muay Thai kickboxing, a lot of different martial arts there, and won a U.S. kickboxing title. And then the UFC started and decided I was going to set my sights on winning a UFC title, which I did in 98 till 2001, held the title for, it was actually about 3.5 years. And then coached 12 world champions and put 95 kids into televised careers.
Wow.
Did a lot of broadcasting as well for CBS Showtime, ESPN, and Mark Cuban's Access TV. And but most recently, for the past several years, I've been focused on really what I've applied my knowledge that I learned from coaching and healing myself from lifelong respiratory disease as a kid, to helping athletes perform at a level they never even dreamed of, and then also helping to educate people about why they suffer from illness and what's going on with their bodies and cellular and mitochondrial health and all of that. And that's really kind of where my passion is, healing, helping people heal themselves. They can go down the path of educating themselves on what foods to put in their bodies, what supplements, what nutrients, and then also what's going on with our soil, how badly our soil's kind of messed up. And so that's really what I focus on these days.
Yeah, well, you're in the agricultural hotbed, as they would say, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And a lot of people think, the most fertile soil in the world, in the Midwest, Iowa, all that stuff. Well, 50 years of synthetic chemical farming has pretty much killed the soil. You take a shovel out in a farmer's field and good luck finding a worm, let alone, any original microorganisms or anything like that, just because of all the chemical farming that's destroyed the soil. So that's really what we're aiming to do is turn soil around, bring it back to life, which we can do pretty quickly. A year or two, and the soil can be healed. And that's really what this is about, growing a lot of really healthy food and healing the soil so that runoff ends up in our water and isn't, synthetic nitrogens and all of that are causing people health issues with pesticides, herbicides, and all the other stuff, right?
Yeah. So you take out, trained some world-renowned athletes, and you created the Pat Miletich Fighting System. Now, you have a secret weapon behind that fighting system that you couldn't tell people about before, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I healed myself from lifelong respiratory disease. Did that at about age 19 or 20. And that's the only reason that I was able to win the U.S. kickboxing title and then the UFC title, was because I completely turned my health around. So I went in from a lifelong respiratory disease to starting to treat myself with high-powered concentrated organics. Antioxidants is what they're called, to remove synthetic chemicals and heavy metals out of my cells and get rid of the inflammation that was causing my respiratory illness to begin with. All of a sudden, 10 days later, I'm sparring with world-class boxers instead of 3 rounds and suffocating to 10 rounds. And then all of a sudden I'm running, 16.5-minute 5Ks, eventually dunking a basketball at 5'10", benching 370 pounds, and just completely changing my life, right? And so I applied that same science, so to speak, that same knowledge to the athletes that I coached. So I took what were generally really healthy people and then turning them into, I guess you would call them superhumans. And they were able to do things endurance-wise that, for 8 to 10 weeks, up to 12 weeks for fight camps where, you're training 2 to 3 hours in the morning and then 2 to 3 hours in the evening at very intense levels, and then waking up the next morning and not being sore, having plenty of energy, and being able to do it all over again for week after week after week until fight time. So you're turning loose, you're taking the leash off of a monster at that point. And that I apply that same program to just helping people who are suffering from different manifestations of inflammation in their bodies, whether it's respiratory inflammation, digestive, joint issues, whatever it is, muscle problems. That same program to help people, educate them on what's causing their issues with their health. So that's what I try to help people with.
How did you get introduced to this?
I just got sick of not being able to breathe. I mean, my entire childhood growing up wrestling, I suffocated, felt like I was suffocating every wrestling match. And I just got sick of it. And I was getting ready to turn pro in kickboxing. And I said to myself, if I don't figure out my endurance issue, my breathing issue, I'm gonna probably get seriously hurt.
Yeah.
So that's really what it was. And then I just went down the route of reading, a lot of research.
Yeah.
Found out about antioxidants from a couple of experts, homeopathic doctors, and dug into that, and then found some supplements at the time, 35 years ago, that were, really high grade, substances that you're never going to find in a GNC or Vitamin World or any of that. This is a whole different level of substance. And they're not created in laboratories. They're created naturally in the natural world.
Yeah, like they test people when they go into these fights and things for different substances, right? Like steroids and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. So this is people in the military use the products that I tell people to use. Professional athletes, across the board, anyone that gets tested, you're fine, because these are basically just the concentrated nutrients of plants is what it is.
Do you want to tell the people what the product is, and we'll leave a description in this video so they can check it out?
Yeah, I mean, people can research antioxidant properties in different types of plants that you can eat. Kale, grapes, there's a lot of different plants that have antioxidant properties. But the most powerful one that I've ever found is a fulvic acid that comes from, it's the most nutrient-rich peat bog found on the planet yet. And so the gentleman who discovered this, he searched for years for it. And once he discovered it, he knew to go down about 45, 50 feet below the surface and then pull that substance up out of the ground. And that is the accumulation, concentrated nutrients of 1,500 different types of plants that have basically decomposed for 60,000 years. So it's not fossilized. It's still technically a living organism. So all the ancient, pristine microbes are in that sediment layer, and super packed again with nutrients. And what we're looking to do, the intended goal of antioxidants in general, and I've found this one to be the most powerful antioxidant substance that I've seen in my 35 years. The stated goals are: one, you want to fix gut biome, right? The bacteria balance in your digestive system, and also one, to raise oxygen levels in the cells as much as possible while removing synthetic chemicals and heavy metals out of the cells that are in when you talk to experts who are being honest with you, will tell you those are the drivers of all different manifestations of inflammation, right? So once you understand that, you understand that there's no such thing as disease. Disease does not exist. It is just merely different manifestations of inflammation, no matter where it manifests or how it manifests. That's all it is. So if we can remove the things that are the drivers and cause of that, generally the symptoms of that particular form of inflammation subside quite a bit, and many times, go away. So that's kind of what our goals are.
So is there a difference? Obviously there has to be some kind of difference. Can you physically feel this when you're taking this? Can you feel a difference?
Yeah, I again have experimented on myself for 35 years. It definitely does make a difference. I would say the athletes, from ultra runners, some of my friends who are guys who run 100 miles inside of 30 hours, right? These guys are in their 50s. They've been running for decades. They improved their per mile time by a minute and a half. Generally, was about the average per mile, a minute and a half faster, and their heart rate was 30 beats less per minute. So that's just one example. And you don't just suddenly do that in your 50s unless you're putting something really, really powerful and important into your body and into your cells, right?
Yeah.
So that's really, in terms of combat athletes, people that are combat athletes, if you get tired in a fight, well, you get sent to the hospital, right?
Yeah.
So super important for people to understand that if I'm going to listen to anybody, it's going to be a special forces guy, a ranger, a SEAL, people who've had to hike up through the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan, guys who have put things into their body, professional athletes who their health literally depends and their well-being depends on their endurance and being able to get through, whether it's a fight or whatever it is, and come out the other side relatively unscathed. So those are the type of athletes that I'm going to listen to, and people that I'm going to listen to, and that's what I try to get through to people is that it's one thing to lose a basketball game, but it's another thing to lose a fight, especially at a high level, because you've got very dangerous individuals who can do a massive amount of damage in a short amount of time if you're too fatigued to defend yourself.
So when you were in the midst of fighting, what was some of the injuries that you sustained, and were you taking this product when you were taking it when you were fighting?
I discovered this particular substance, this fulvic acid, about 5 years ago. But I was taking a combination of antioxidants back when I was competing as a professional athlete. And I had a lot of injuries, joint injuries, spinal injuries, lacerations, things like that. Mostly in training is where, I got hurt. But it was super important to be able to recoup and come back and heal up from those things and be ready to fight. Because, you don't get paid if you don't fight. Yeah. So, I did have injuries where for instance, before the first UFC that I fought in, I had a couple of heavyweights land on my leg. My leg was locked out. I was against the wall trying to stop a takedown, and two heavyweights who were wrestling nearby fell on my straight leg and basically trashed my knee pretty well. So I had to recover and rehab in time to fight in that first UFC tournament, which I ended up, of course, winning. But those are the types of things that do happen in training.
Were you worried when you were going into that fight, having that injury?
No, I'd fully recovered by then, but I was definitely worried for a couple of months rehabbing. I can tell you that.
Yeah, if you were going to be ready on time, right?
Right.
So, do you remember your first ever fight outside of the UFC? Did you ever have your first fight outside of the ring?
When I was about 6 years old, I got beat up by the middle school wrestling coach's son. His name was John McCutcheon. That's why I decided I was going to take up wrestling, and I didn't like feeling helpless, so I decided I was going to go out for wrestling and try to avoid that from happening in the future.
And he was the wrestling coach's son?
Yeah.
How did that work out once you're getting coached by him?
Oh, we became good friends over, through middle school, high school, all that.
I always hear that.
Yeah, and his dad was a great guy, Coach McCutcheon, and then Coach Glenn. They were the coaches at the Bettendorf Middle School, and they went 11 straight years without losing a single dual meet. So, and my 8th grade year was the 11th year where we set the record, national record.
So you've been bringing it to another level since you were young.
Well, that's in Bettendorf, Iowa. That's just kind of the way it was, the bad wrestlers went out for the basketball team. That's just kind of the way it was. Now they had state championship basketball teams as well, so I shouldn't bag on those guys. But it still is, really a hotbed for athletics and football, basketball, golf, wrestling. I mean, you name the sport, cross country, whatever. They're pretty good at it.
Yeah. So when you were at your peak of your career, right? You're the champion.
Yeah.
Did you find that people would be testing you outside of the ring?
No, I generally stayed out of those types of situations, but I had a few people who did, a couple different instances where I had people do that. I got attacked one time in a club, four gentlemen, and had to defend myself, and it didn't work out well for them, but I clearly stated that I didn't want any trouble, and I continued to back up until they pinned me against a wall.